She was trying to be ordinary. A barista with a scarred knuckle, a woman who answered to a name that was not a rank and who measured days by tips and the weather. Then, a veteran sitting at table 6 said 3 simple, impossible words. "We need you." Those words pulled Maya Reyes back through doors she'd thought closed and into a night where debt and danger braided together. A missing extraction, a private security company that trafficked more than arms, and a moral ledger that demanded settlement. This is a story about a woman negotiating the edges of violence and mercy, about a team stitched from old debts and new loyalty, and about how the only true redemption is the hard work of choosing to keep going when everything wants to end. Tone cinematic, intimate, and urgent, themes duty, agency, and the stubborn persistence of hope. The rain had a way of making the harbor smell like something from a different century. Salt and rope and iron, with a metallic sweetness from the seawater and a faint, distant smell of diesel. Maya Reyes tucked her wet hair behind one ear, the streak of silver near her temple catching the low light from the bistro window. The bell above the door chimed, and she kept working. A slow pour of espresso, the hum of conversation folded around her, the jukebox playing something that felt old and safe. Off duty, she told herself, off shift, off the grid. The apron around her waist hid the tightness in her shoulders and the 3 shallow scars that ran across the inside of her right wrist like a moth-eaten road map. She liked this small life. There was a pleasure in making something ordinary well, the measured tamp of grounds, the hiss of steam, the way a lat's surface accepted a leaf of foam like it was offering permission to stay. The regulars liked that, too. They liked her face and the way she knew their orders before they could settle into their chairs. People she didn't have to save. Table 6 had been empty all morning, then filled with a man who watched the room as if he had been compiling an inventory of exits. He ordered black coffee and read a newspaper without folding it, as if the act of scanning headlines was enough to keep something across the ocean from catching him unawares. He was a long way from the uniform he had once worn. Civilian coat, hair cropped short, a parallel scar that cut his jaw. But his hands were the hands of a man who had held a rifle and a compass and the ribs of boats. He was the kind of person you recognized from photographs in briefing rooms, older than the stars on his chest, younger than the H behind his eyes. Jonah Carter. She knew the name because once the world had been smaller, units had names. She had spent nights on ships, in makeshift clinics, stitching people back together who had been less fortunate than the rest of them. Once she had been someone other people relied on. He met her gaze as she set his cup down. His eyes were the particular brittle gray of a man who'd learned to see light as a surveyor does, calculating distances in the spaces between details. He smiled the faint, private smile of someone who had once been saved by a stranger's hand. "You're off duty?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Always," she answered. Her voice was all surface, bright, quick, the way a lid kept steam from escaping. Jonah folded the paper and set it aside. Table 6 never stays empty long. He looked past her to the low windows where fog feathered in like the edge of a secret. "I wasn't sure you'd still be around." She shrugged. "People leave, people come." "The coffee's good." More surface. He waited as if weighing whether to say more. Outside, a delivery truck unloaded cases of oysters. The smell of brine returned to the room. Somewhere in the kitchen, Emma, the owner, banged the sink in a way that meant go quicker. And Maya moved to the espresso machine, fingers already remembering the sequence, even as she kept the conversation thin. "You look like bad news in civvies," she said, because there are ways to resent being recognized and ways to be polite about it. "Sit or don't. I'm not your ghost." Ajana laughed once, a short sound. "No ghosts. Not here." He dropped a folded business card on the table like a challenge. "We're in town for a week." She glanced at the card. SEAL Team 6. The letters felt like a fossilized animal on paper. Her mind offered a memory of a night, a decade ago, a black ops extraction that had gone sideways, an impossible decision in a hallway where light and shadow had both lied. There had been screams. There had been a girl's hand that she had not quite been able to keep. Maya closed her jaw against the taste of memory. Why are you telling me this? Her tone should have settled the steam. It didn't. Jonah didn't flinch. He had the patience of men who had waited out storms and helicopters. Because you were there, Maya. You were the one who held the line. The jukebox clicked, a song that tasted like cigarette smoke and victory. She felt the blood in her ears. That was a long time ago. Long enough to be forgiven by some, long enough to be chased by others. Jonah's hands folded, knuckles like small islands. We need you. 3 words, small as a match struck in a cathedral. They ignited something she had been dousing for years. Maya laughed, but it was a brittle, wrong sound. We. You need me. You're a Sahel. He looked like he expected her disbelief and shrugged. We're a small team now. Numbers are smaller than the threats. We lost a man on an extraction 2 nights ago in Dara Bay. It went south. The marking on the operation. The fingerprints. Point to someone who remembers your name. The bistro seemed to tilt. The world had this habit: you could build a life out of carefully stacked plates, and then a single breath could scatter them into a dozen reflective pieces. Who is someone? She asked. She could hear the doors closing. She could feel the edges of her old life like the rim of a plate under her palms. Jonah's mouth tightened. A private security contractor called Halcyon. They sell protection and more. Discrete assets for people with money and no conscience. Their regional director is a man named Alex Marlowe. He runs with impunity and has friends who don't like things being opened. He slid a photo across the wood. A man in a suit, clean-shaven, a smile that looked practiced. Marlowe's been buying names. We think he has a ledger on an extraction that included civilians that shouldn't have been. A girl went missing. Her file listed Maya Reyes as the medic who stabilized someone at the time. The photo sat between them like a splinter. Maya was suddenly very aware of the scar on her wrist, the little notch that appeared when she flexed her hand. Other people called it bravery. She called it the cost of capacity. A girl missing. Her mind supplied the memory she tried not to summon. A room with flickering fluorescent light. A girl with a bruise like a map across her cheek. And the sound. A child's voice saying, "Remember me." She had tried to remember. She had failed. "Why come to me?" Maya asked. Her words cut the distance with the care of a scalpel. Why not task a team, find Marlowe, take him down? Jonah's eyes went to the window as if some map was being drawn there by rain. Because that girl's name was Lena Alvarez. She was 7. She was on the manifest that night. Marlowe's ledger lists her as a commodity. We think he's trafficking kids out of places no one's watching. Silence folded into the bistro. Someone knocked a chair. The clatter sounded like a gunshot in a sepia war scene. Maya's hands were still on the espresso machine. She felt the familiar tightening behind her ribs, a knot of muscle that remembered the snap of a tourniquet. Her life had been small acts of care to keep the interior from cracking open. She'd made peace with the way the world had left its marks. Lena Alvarez. A child's face that belonged to a file, to a ghost she tried to put to rest. Why my name specifically? She asked, because there is always a reason a name surfaces in a ledger. Jonah's jaw worked. Because Halcyon marked certain nights with certain nitics. Your name popped up with Marlowe's contacts. They think you were the one who could identify assets afterward. We think you took something, or that you saw something. Maya considered the truth a long time, the way one might trace a scar's path to figure how deep it went. She had been there, yes. There had been a girl in a hallway who looked at her as if she were the shore. There had also been orders, radio chatter, and an impossible decision. The memory tasted like iron. I left, Maya said. Simple past tense, a small legalistic sentence. Jonah's voice was the kind that could be used to thread a life back together or pull at the stitches. We need you because we don't have a medic who can do what you can. We need you because if Marlowe's ledger is true, there's people already moved through a pipeline, and we want to find them before they're gone. She thought of the kitchen window and the way the rain blurred the harbor, and everything into an impressionist painting of motion. She thought of Lena Alvarez and the way a child's voice could sound at a distance that was never far enough. She thought of the law and the way it sometimes shrugged and turned its face away. "What's in it for me?" she asked. A practical question, a humane question. Jonah's eyes held a softness that surprised her. "A chance to close a door," said. "A chance to make what you couldn't fix, fixed. And there are people who won't stop until someone stops them." It wasn't a promise. It was the right kind of honesty, blunt and dangerous. Maya felt the old engine of her life start like a boat that remembered how to run when the tide called its name. She had come here to be ordinary. The ordinary had the peculiar cruelty of not fitting the shape of a life built to save people. It was almost funny. The world had a way of knocking at your door precisely when you meant to leave it closed. 1 week, she said. "You have 1 week to prove you're not taking me into a war to die for somebody else's ledger." Jonah's mouth quirked. 1 week then, we'll get you whatever you need. But we leave tomorrow." She slept badly that night. The kind of light sleep she had learned to cultivate as a field medic, attentive to the smallest sounds, the scrape that could become an alarm. Her apartment was a small shoebox above the bistro window overlooking the alley where pigeons fought over French fries. She laid out the things she kept: a needle kit, a small Swiss Army knife, a photo of her mother with a crooked smile. She put on clothes she hadn't worn since she had packed away uniforms like used maps. When dawn pressed itself into the room, she felt like a woman unfolding. Jonah's team was smaller than the photos suggested him, a wiry technician named Malik who spoke in clipped sentences and had fingers stained with solder, Eva, a former intelligence analyst whose face didn't give away her thoughts, and a hulking man called Boone, quiet and wide, who had once been a demolitionist and now preferred to solve problems with the gravitational logic of mass. They had the sort of easy competence that arrived from years of rehearsing violence until it shed its taste for romance and became pure craft. They were all carrying ghosts. Maya fit into their dynamic like a prosthetic of muscle and steadiness. She was not the same woman who had once stepped into flooded basements and held children's hands while the world trembled. She was more careful now, but once you taught your hands to save people, they remembered even when your brain wanted to forget. They flew in the dark, planes cutting through clouds like knives. Jonah sat beside her, hands folded, eyes closed for a moment. "You ever think about what's left after all this?" he asked without looking at her. "What?" Maya's voice was the hum of a plane engine between words. "What's left of who you were?" He turned so fast it looked like a jump. "You left for a reason, but something pulls you back." She considered the ceiling's contour for a long time, the way the yellow reading light burned in the small space. "People get stolen," she said. "Some people have mistakes that never stop walking. They landed in a field that smelled like pine and fear, and the team's truck ate the dark road until they reached a community that housed the kind of men who sold true names." It looked normal enough. A facade of warehouses, a security gate, guardhouses with the stubborn light of men who counted keys like rosary beads. Halcyon's compound sat behind a line of black SUVs that reflected the industrial dawn. The guard at the gate looked like someone who'd been told his job was sacred and not to be questioned. Maya felt the familiar drumbeat of adrenaline at the base of her neck. The the sort that told her nothing good happened here. They moved at night. Boone's hand on her back was a brief, grounding pressure as they slid under perimeter and into the belly of Halcyon. Malik's drones hummed above like nervous bees, probing for itinerary. Eva intercepted comm chatter clearances, names, times. "They're shipping tonight," she said quietly, voice like a scalpel. 2 trucks. One headed north. The manifest lists miners. Maya's stomach clenched into a small, panicked knot. The sick electric jolt of recognition, the one that told her she had once been right beside a child in a cold hallway, flashed hot and ugly. "Where?" she asked. "Out to an airfield 2 hours west," Jonah said. "If we get there, we might intercept. If we don't—" He didn't finish the sentence because the space after "if we don't" was filled with the kind of horror that used to make him sleep with his hand above his rifle. They planned like surgeons. Maya found herself slipping into roles with graceful efficiency, triage, extraction, field improvisation. The night folded itself into a map of threat and hope. They moved like a single organism, Jonah calling coordinates, Malik guiding drones, Eva hacking access systems with the brittle elegance of a pianist. Boone drove like a man who used trucks the way other men used their hands. With secure ownership, they found the trucks, 2 black beasts idling in the soft light of an airstrip that smelled of fuel and wet earth. The drivers wore halcyon patches, curved white wings on black, and the men who stood around them looked like they were waiting for wit that would never taste of conscience. The air was thin in a way that made every sound sharp. Boots on gravel sounded like rifle shots. Maya's heart hammered, not with the old heady pulse of battle, but something more savage, the need to be fast enough to undo a wrong. They moved in, careful, because they had to be. A slip here could mean the last names on a manifest were erased from the ledger before anyone had time to say anything about it. The first truck had 2 rows of crates in the back. Maya's fingers brushed wood, and then, in the second crate, felt the smallness of a child's wrist. She stopped, breathless, as if someone had put a fist on her sternum. "Don't open it here," Jonah murmured. He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "We secure perimeter, then we take them." Malik's drone found a camera blind spot, and Eva used it like a key. Boone lifted the truck's back door as if it were a curtain. Maya's gloves smelled of diesel and the child's fear. She reached in and found a girl curled up like a creature, trying to be small enough to be invisible. Her hair was tangled, her face pale but alive with a kind of stubborn light that made Maya's throat close. "Lena," the girl whispered when Maya said her name. It wasn't the same Lena as from the file. Different last name, same child's voice. Maya's hands trembled, and she pressed a medic's training into motion, warmth, oxygen. The small contact of human skin that told a person they were not alone. Marlowe's men moved like dogs that had been kept hungry, and so were faster than expected. They arrived in a half-minute that felt like an hour. Bullets sang. For a span of minutes that stretched, the air was a map of sound. Jonah moved with a surgeon's economy, each motion designed to end a threat with the least unnecessary cruelty. Maya wrapped Lena in a thermal blanket, while Boone fired a suppression burst that smashed through an air compressor with a sound like a cathedral collapsing. Malik's drone found a man holding a clipboard and a cigarette who barked orders that didn't matter anymore. They got out with Lena and one other child, a boy who blinked at the light like a man learning the rules of a new world. The truck they escaped in smelled like heat and adrenaline. Their exit route was a hairpin of bad luck, and luck that the team had saved up like credit, a roadblock that did not materialize, a searchlight that failed. For every step they won, Halcyon scrambled a dozen more men. Jonah's voice over the radio was calm and steady and terrifying in that way of people who had accepted the possible end and refused to hurry it. They reached a safe house, an old storage unit that had been converted into a room with a bed and a lamp that made everything look softer than it was. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, Lena's small weight on her knees, and felt the world crack less with each breathing child. Lena turned her head and pressed her face against Maya's wrist, where the scars traced the inside. "You were the lady," she said. "You were the one who had the light." Maya pressed her forehead to the child's and felt the strange exhale of someone who had been doing penance without a litany. "I'm Maya," she whispered. "I'm Maya Rise." The child smiled like a sunrise, all small and brave. It was a look that might have been enough to end a war. For a day they were safe. For a day they ate rice and rested, and tried to be the sort of people who could imagine food after fear. But Halcyon could not be ignored. The ledger was not simply a set of files, it was leverage. Marlowe moved like a man who had bought chains in bulk. He had money and connections and the ability to make coffins look like accidents. They had resources. Jonah's team had grit. The intelligence they gathered over the next 2 days painted a map of a larger, uglier project. Halcyon was a front, a funnel for people whose names disappeared because too many people were willing to let them. The company sold security services to governments and contractors, and at the same time broke people into smaller, manageable pieces to be exported by client lists. Each asset moved was one less accident Halcyon had to account for. "Why do they do it?" Lena asked once, while Eva was checking injections and Boone was sleeping like a man who expects to be awoken at the wrong hour. Lena's question landed in the room like a question that belonged to children and knights. Maya looked at the girl and felt older than she had the right to. "Because somewhere, someone decided that money is better than a person," she said. "Because when enough people look away, the worst things can happen." Jonna crouched across from them. "We need to go to Marlowe's ledger. We need proof. If we can put him on the record, we can bring down his contractors. We can make it very expensive to be immoral." Maya found herself thinking about the ledger like a wound you could stitch closed if you had the right instruments. She wanted to tear it out. She wanted to rip the ledger's pages like paper and let them fall into a river that cleaned things as it swallowed the men who had written it. But people were not ledger pages. People were messy and stubborn and hard to fix with a single categorical victory. They found a way into Halcyon. Eva's hacks were the deftest sort of rebellion, invisible fingers slipping into windows of code, turning locks into the mechanical equivalent of a joke. The ledger sat on a server in a basement office that smelled of coffee and the slight sweetness of someone who thought their crimes would not be followed into the dark. Maya's hands were steady as she watched Eva copy files and Malik set up feeds. The building itself seemed to breathe accusation, its lights like many small eyes. Marlowe's office was an island of sterile wood and a view that looked like he owned the city. There was a framed photo of him shaking hands with a senator. A lamp cast a condescending pool of light on a nameplate. He had the kind of face that made people think of trust. Well-pressed suit, open palms, tie knots like friendly promises. Jonah had said he was clean, cut, and dangerous, and the room made that easy to believe. Amaya unrolled an image from the ledger and saw a child's face next to a shipping manifest. There were dates and names and transfer codes. The words were small, like ants at a picnic. They were the kind of proof that could be used to make a man very unpopular with his investors. "Copy everything," Jonah said. "We'll get whatever we can." His voice held the urgency of a man who had lost before. The extraction of data set off a cascade of alarms. Men in suits moved like polar bears, slow, purposeful, impossible to divert from their path. The team moved with efficient violence. It was messy and sharp and underscored by a moral clarity that maybe only people who had seen too much possessed. Some things were worth getting dirty for. They left with the ledger copied and the server bed empty. They also left with a cost. Halcyon had a list of contractors and a number of men who would buy revenge like jewelry. Their escape route was compromised. Bullets arsed like angry fish through air. Malik's drone was shot down. Boone took a hit that would leave him with a limp that would call itself an annoyance for years. Back at the safe house, Eva's fingers flew over keys while Maya stitched Boone's leg with the cool focus of someone who could hold a trauma steady. The ledger copy sat on a laptop like an accusation. "We publish it," Eva said, voice flat as a scalpel. "We give it to anyone who'll take it. Newsrooms, watchdog groups. People who like settings where men in suits get called to account." Maya felt a coldness settle. "Do you think that'll stop them?" she asked. "Do you think the men who run this world respond to shame?" Jonah's eyes were dark as the strip of ocean at night. "Sometimes they do. Sometimes it brings a legal hand that moves with weight. Sometimes it makes them move their assets where they can't be attacked. Sometimes it just makes them angrier." They chose to publish. The ledger splashed across networks like an oil slick on glass. The first wave was confusion, then denial, then the slow creak of institutions saying the words that sound like justice. "We will investigate." Marlowe's name became a stain that could not be easily scrubbed. Marlowe did not react as the movies said he would. There was no theatrical call to arms. He moved like someone who had been given a map of the terrain and a note that said, "Pick a route." He called in favors. He bought silence and used it as a weapon. He also, because he was an animal used to producing currency, decided to buy off the ledger's witnesses and the team's allies. The attack came on a rain-swept night that turned the harbor into a reflection of every wrong. Men in black rose like a bad tide and found the safe house. Lena was in Maya's arms when the first gunshots cut into the air. The firefight was a cathedral of shattered glass. Jonah moved like a man who had been carved by conflict, precise, purposeful, merciless when necessary. Maya's hands were blood and plaster and determination. They made it to a rooftop where the night felt clean and loud and terrible in its way. Boone held a wound in his thigh and spat when asked if he thought he'd be okay. Eva was silent, her face set like flint as she fed coordinates into a radio. They could have run. They could have folded into the bread of anonymity. Instead, something else guided them, the ledger on the laptop, the face of Lena, the smallness of the children they had pulled from the cold. They had a choice: let fear swing like a gate and lock them out, or open a new gate and step through. Marlowe moved like a man who had been given the moral claustrophobia of those who profit from others' freedom. He had to protect his profit. He sent men to reclaim what he'd called product with the same tender cruelty an accountant uses to balance books. But Jonah's team was organized in a way that suggested they believed in the kind of violence that had a purpose. They wanted to stop what Marlowe had started, not continue it. The final confrontation happened in a warehouse that smelled of metal and old rain. Marlowe stood amid crates stamped with coded markings. He wore a suit like armor. He offered Jonah a handshake that meant 1,000 things. "You ruined a business," he said, voice oily. "People like me do things for clients. It's commerce, not evil." Jonah smiled then, the sort of smile that told of loss and a weird professional tenderness. "You sold children, Marlowe. That's not commerce. That's a war crime, and you dressed it in a ledger like it was a quarterly sales report." Marlowe shrugged with a gentleman's bored interest. "You lovely idealists, always thinking words fix things. The ledger's copies are backups. You didn't shine a light on the dark so much as you lit a candle. Candles die. There is a moment that comes in assaults of this kind where a person's life breaks down into a set of decisions: to kill, to be killed, to choose mercy, to choose vengeance." Jonah stepped forward, words precise and cold. "Put the children back," he said. Marlowe laughed. The laugh was small and brittle. "And if I don't?" Maya stepped forward, as if pulled by an invisible cord. She had been off duty in a bookstore life for too long. Something inside her demanded correction. "Then we'll take them," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in that quiet was the same thing that had made men listen when she'd given orders in a corridor of a field hospital. The room seemed to breathe in that sound. Marlowe took a step back. He judged the room like a trader counting currency. He had guns, sponsors, and an obscene amount of money. He also had people in the room who were tired of his money. The exchange wasn't clean. There were shots fired. There were injuries marked like tally marks in a book. Jonah disarmed a man, and then another. Hands that had learned the choreography of ending danger. Maya found Marlowe's ledger in a crate and smashed it with a crowbar until the pages were confetti. "You can put it back together," Marlowe hissed. "Paper can be copied. Files can be recovered." Maya looked at him as if she meant to carve her answer into the bone of his conscience. "We don't need perfect proof to make a life change," she said. "We just need to be loud. We need people who can stand in the light." They left the warehouse with more children than they'd had the night before, with Boone's leg bleeding and Jonah carrying a gash along his scalp that would knit into a new scar. They also left with a ledger that, even shredded, had been photographed and distributed. The law moved slowly, but when enough light found the places men thought were safe, slow turned into something sharper. Months later, Halcyon was a brand with a stain too visible to scrub. Marlowe's name required travel only via private security and low-slung hope. Investors withdrew because the cost of his sins was finally being counted. The legal machinery ground and cut and sometimes failed, but it did not ignore the evidence. It was not perfect. No justices. But it was better than the ledger's silence. Maya returned to the bistro eventually because there are places like home that let you hold a life together like China. She had earned new scars and had kept the ancient ones. Jonah sat at table 6 sometimes when he was not elsewhere, and their conversations moved between strategy and the kind of small talk that felt like bandages to the soul. Lena came to the bistro with a mother who had been found in a shelter run by a woman who refused to be bought. She waved at Maya like someone who had an inside joke with the world. Maya's hands learned to pour foam and dazzle with a leaf. She put a jar beside the register labeled "for the kids" and joked when it filled faster than the tip jar. She never stopped being a medic or a thief of time for restless hearts. She still kept a small kit tucked beneath the counter because some things in the world had to be prepared for. The ledger had scarified something into the city's skin that could not be easily erased. But in its wake, other things grew: people who shouted the truth into rooms where someone else had hoped their whispers would stay. Jonah stayed close, his presence a map of both safety and possibility, and sometimes he would say 3 words that made her laugh because they were as inevitable as sunrise. Wu did it. They had done it, in the working, broken sense. They had saved names from ledger pages and decided that a life could be more than the sum of the things taken from it. Redemption, Maya found, was not a single act or a speech. It was the small work of showing up again and again, of tending to people who were not oneself, and of understanding that to be off duty was sometimes a luxury you couldn't afford. On a rainy evening, that mirrored the one when Jonah first said the words. Maya stood at the bistro window and watched the harbor breathe. Jonah came in and sat at table 6 as he always did, the jukebox making the room warm and a little brave. He smiled at her across the steam of coffee. She walked over and set a cup down. He looked up and said, "You came back." She set her hand on the table and, for a moment, let the idea of being ordinary unfold. "I was never really off duty," she said. "Not the way some people are." He folded his hands and watched her like a man who had learned to value the things that lasted. "Good," he said. "Because there's always someone who needs a hand." Outside, the rain made a kind of music against the glass. Inside, people ate and argued, and loved in small, loud ways. Lena ran through the bistro with a laugh like bells. Maya watched her and felt something like a full heartbeat. Sadder, gentler, truer than the one that had pulsed in her chest when she had first left. There are stories where one sentence draws a person back into a fight. For Maya, it had been 3 words that made her leave the life she'd built and return to the one she had never truly abandoned. For everyone there, for the ledger, and the men who had thought they could own the world, the cost had been higher than they'd planned. For Lena and the others, life had been reclaimed. Maya wiped the counter and folded her hands. Outside, the harbor steamed and reflected lights like scattered gold. Inside, the heat of the kitchen rolled out like a promise. She had been off duty. Then, the seal at table 6 said 3 words that changed everything. She had chosen to answer the door, and the world, crooked and stubborn, had changed along with her.